Hi there and welcome back. In the second video of this free online course, Is God Dead?, I'm going to share a brief introduction that I kind of skipped over from the first video, and then offer a series of 5 key concepts necessary for beginning to answer the question, Is God dead? These 5 key concepts include 1. An explanation of how philosophy and theology are the oldest ways Westerners have sought truth, and how that legacy still informs our understanding of God. Second, I'll offer a plausible but not certain history of where the idea of God came from. I then, third, will discuss the importance of recognizing that monotheism is a culturally specific sociological descriptor. That is, it doesn't refer to a set of beliefs, but a community bound together by a set of beliefs. Fourth, I'll distinguish theism from monotheism, understanding theism as the name of the belief system within monotheism, but they're not synonymous, and then I'll offer several examples of famous philosophical arguments that try and prove the existence of God. Finally, I will discuss in some detail the concept of idolatry and explain how it is always a counterpart to the concept of monotheism. That is, you can't explain or understand one without attention to the other. So I'm Christopher Driscoll, a professor of religion, culture, and spirituality. And for years, my most popular class on campus has been Is God Dead? The class equips both believers and non-believers to more adequately defend their positions. Students leave class able to enter dialogue about difficult topics with people from different backgrounds holding different beliefs. For years, I've wanted to offer a version of the class to the public. Why should my students be the only ones who have access to it? So here it is. Welcome to the course. If the content resonates with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. These likes tell YouTube to put the content in front of more people who they already know might enjoy it. So if you enjoy it, help me get it in front of others. The question of God's death has been discussed since at least as early as Nietzsche's proclamation by the madman in 1888 that, quote, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And that's what I talk about in lesson 1. And I encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet. I'll put the tag up here in the corner. But what does that mean? God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And what do we need to know in order to investigate what that means? To answer these questions, let's skip ahead in time a bit to the 1960s. The April 8th, 1966 Time magazine cover story, Is God Dead? The article explored the idea that God was no longer a central part of people's lives, and that science and technology had replaced religion as the dominant source of explanation and understanding of the universe. The piece also discussed the trend of young people turning away from religion and the decline of religious institutions, trends that we see continuing up to this day. The article concluded that while God may not be completely dead, traditional religion was certainly in decline. So that was in the 1960s. Things have gotten worse or better depending on your perspective. According to various sources from the 1960s, the majority of Americans then considered themselves religious and attended church regularly. In the mid-1960s, surveys showed that about 75 to 80% of Americans specifically identified as Christian, and about 40 to 45% of them reported attending church on a weekly basis. As for specific belief in God, it's difficult to quantify, but surveys from the 60s suggest that a significant majority of Americans still believed in God then. Most estimates are around 95% or more of Americans believed in a higher power or deity. That's a lot. Now fast forward to today. According to the most recent Pew Research Center survey on religion and public life, which was conducted in 2019, the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian has declined over the past several decades and now stands at around 65%. Additionally, the percentage of Americans who attend church regularly has also declined, with about 25% of adults reporting that they attend religious services on a weekly basis. That means affiliation is still higher than what we might expect, but participation is at an all-time low, you might say. The same Pew Research Center survey found that about 3/4 of the U.S. say they still believe in God with absolute certainty, somewhere between 75 and 80%. Now note, that's a dip. That's a pretty significant dip. Granted, these numbers can fluctuate based on the survey and things like that, but it seems clear, no matter who you ask, that the overall trend in the United States over the last several decades has been declining church attendance and religious affiliation. Now, what this means is that membership, affiliation, dissatisfaction with institutions has increased, but it also notes that, by and large, Americans are still a believing country. We're one of the most believing countries in the Western world, that's for sure, and we remain so. Nevertheless, there are more and more non-theists, atheists, humanists, other sorts of folks who don't identify as believing in God than ever before. And it could be that many of those folks have always been around, but that because of the weight of belief in the social world, they didn't feel comfortable sharing that position for one reason or another. Now, there are some implications to this data that I'm sharing. These declining numbers are largely responsible for why most people today, when they think of American Christianity, they think of vocal right-wing evangelicals who go to non-denominational churches. And those are certainly an example of American Christianity. The reason for this is because across the same decades that overall church membership and belief have been in decline, a small but critical and vocal mass of folks have become the face of contemporary American Christianity. Some have called these folks the moral majority and have well-known politicians who have championed the cause of the culture wars, backing them. Figures like Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, Mike Huckabee, and others have sought to connect the declining rates of religion in the U.S. to sentiments and trends demonstrating a general decline in American influence and authority, both here and abroad. Now, while President Trump's brashness and vulgarity effectively marked the end of these pretenses towards morality within American politics, the basic idea that the country needs to believe in God in order to flourish persists in many camps. One prominent proponent of this is Sean Feucht, Christian musician and worship leader, who came into prominence as the figurehead of the Let Us Worship movement during the COVID-19 lockdown. Now, I'm a critic of Feucht, but I also appeared in the film Super Spreader, which is a largely celebratory account of that movement. The reason I appeared in it is simple. I may not be a fan of his politics, but he and many members of the moral majority are right when they worry about the health of the nation in what I, in my own work, have called the twilight of American religion. It isn't simply a political opinion that religion is good for the nation. Now, it isn't agreed upon either. Now, what many scholars would hold is that for a nation to work effectively, there needs to be belief in something. In the U.S., for centuries, white American Christianity served that role. Today, that's beginning to change. And in many respects, I think that's a good thing. You could check my track record. But I also follow Nietzsche's worries that if we know Christianity is bad, but we also know we need belief to be a functioning or a healthy country, where do we turn? This is what the question of is God dead is all about. For some, the death of God is a moment to celebrate, like Thomas Altizer, who's mentioned in kind of the centerpiece of that Time magazine article. But for others, the death of God is a warning about culture and a call for Christian renewal. Nietzsche wanted to celebrate the death of God, but somehow he knew better, or at least his madman knew better. What do you think? Join me as we continue to journey along in this course and pick up some of the tools that will help you decide for yourself. Is it possible for a nation to function effectively without the society believing in something to unify them? Now, for many, you might want that to be Christian or Christianity or God or Yahweh, but think broadly here. Does it have to be that? My concern is not so much the what. It has more to do with how, whether it's possible or not. American football comes close to the importance once shown to traditional American Christianity. Will that unify us? Will that hold us together? Maybe so, maybe not. The question for me, and I invite you to ask it as well, is, can a society sustain itself without that kind of a glue holding it together? Frankly, I'm not so sure. So I want to spend the rest of this video going over 5 key concepts that are, I think, necessary for understanding what's at stake for us. What do we lose and what do we gain when we talk of the death of God? What are the key concepts, the terms, the definitions that we need in order to know that we're all kind of having the same or a similar or a shared conversation? So with that, thank you again for being here. Now let's get to the first of these key concepts. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to be here with me. You could be anywhere, but you're here, and I appreciate that. And I'm grateful. So the first of these key concepts is that God has to do with truth, always. Now, if you're a believer, you know this. If you're a non-believer, you think that this is some sort of paradox, or it's ironic, the highest irony, because God for you is a lie. But for both of you, believers and non-believers, God always has to do with truth. Now, the 2 oldest ways of arriving at truth in the Western world are what we call philosophy and theology. Philosophy here, meaning the love of wisdom, and in that love, philosophers often search for how we can know and trust our experiences out in the world and our ideas about those experiences. In this way, philosophy often has turned to God as a means of doing that, securing that truth about how the world works with no concern or compunction towards belief or believing. Theology, on the other hand, literally means God talk and has been around basically as long as philosophy. Think of them as parts of the same conversation but taking place from different perspectives. They both rely on our individual experiences to determine an idea as true or not. But philosophy centers the individual human, the rational subject, and theology, on the other hand, centers God. There's a third way to arrive at truth, however, and it's by and large the most popular way these days, and that we tend to think of as the scientific method, a way of ensuring that your experience and my experience could be repeatable over time, replicatable. Philosophy, theology, and science are now the 3 ways that any of us are able to study or learn about God. There is a 4th way, and we call that revelation. But the problem with revelation is it doesn't get outside of that first issue of experience. We can't easily trust if the revelation is true or not. Now, that's a complicated thing because some of these revelations are the most powerful, most truthful experiences of anyone's life. But that doesn't solve what is a logical and rational and scientific problem for us to share in that experience of revelation. Some people think that God reveals God's self in history. Some people think God reveals God's self in the Bible or the Quran, the Talmud, or the Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible. But there's so much contestability with respect to where that revelation takes place that we tend to, when talking in a kind of academic way about these issues, we emphasize the philosophical, the theological, and the scientific. So let's hone in on the philosophical perspective for a moment. This perspective emphasizes the logical reasons why God exists or doesn't. Based on rational reflection on personal experience, which I'll talk about more in lesson 3 and 4 of this free online course, philosophy understands God as part of the puzzle of the universe. Look at the cosmos, for instance. I mean this, pause the video even for a moment, and just reflect on what's happening. If it's nighttime, look outside, maybe look at the stars. Where do they come from? How do they get there? What are they doing? How do they interact? If it's daytime, you can do the same thing with the people. Accidents, always happen. We're always bumping into each other in one way, shape, or form, right? But the majority of us, we're like a well-oiled machine. Even society can reflect a kind of cosmic order. Now, whether it does or not is a question for debate, but it can, depending on your perspective. This is one of the classic proofs for the existence of God. But philosophy will turn to the cosmos and say, doesn't everything fit together? Because it fits together, doesn't that suggest a designer of the universe? This has been called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Theology, on the other hand, is part of what we call faith-based perspectives. Here we learn about God from sacred texts like the Bible and from personal experiences with other believers in a faith community. This focus on community is significant. If I say that I know God loves me because he sent his son to die on a cross for my sins so that I might have eternal life. Now here I'm paraphrasing John 3:16, right? Maybe the most famous single Bible verse in the United States right now. But the truth of the statement relies on whether or not you or the person you're telling it to have had experiences that can confirm that information. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that there's an impasse. There's an impossible jump that has to be made. And for a believer, for an insider to a tradition, it's much easier to make that jump than it is for an outsider. And this is the believer's position, what we call the insider position. It's true because everyone in the community already holds it to be true. On the one hand, some philosophers would call that circular reasoning. On the other hand, it may be that that is the logic of society at large. Society in general. Now here, I hope you can see that even though both philosophy and theology are based on personal experience, they don't always arrive at the same conclusions. While salvation from hell may be one of the truest ideas held by a believer, they have to be a believer to believe in hell in the first place. They say, yeah, but the Bible says that we're all, yeah, well, not everyone reads the Bible. And this, I try and instill in my students. We have to be accountable to this kind of perspective, whether we like it or not. This is why I participated in the Sean Feucht documentary, not to co-sign his position, but to engage. We have to begin the process of re-engaging with one another, regardless. Lastly, there's the scientific perspective. Really, this is better understood as the empirical perspective. And here, what I mean by that is that our experiences still matter, but not in an individual or personal way. Rather, we learn about God by studying the people who believe in God. The statistics I offered at the beginning, for instance, of this video, are an example of true statements about God. When we talk about the declining rates, that is a statistical gleaning of truth. You count. You count who's doing what. And that is a truth that we all share in. Mostly. At least we used to. And that's the third way we think about and find some sort of semblance of truth or what can be held as true when we're talking about the topic of, is God dead or is God alive? These are the three kinds of truths always at work whenever people are talking about, thinking about, or studying God. It's important to note that while each of us probably prioritizes one of these ahead of the other, none of them are more important than the other as far as making sense of God. While a lot of believers will prioritize the faith-based truth, and that's all well and good for them to do, their doing that doesn't help the rest of us understand any better than anyone else. And here I'm not nitpicking. As we'll learn later, the reason for this is because insider experiences are unique to each individual. And they're nearly impossible to fully explain to someone who has not had a religious experience. For the folks of you who have experienced Christian salvation, yes, you can share in that story with your congregation, your mentors, your pastor, your family, but can you share all of it? I don't mean because weird things happened. I mean because, yeah, weird things happen in the sense that words do not do justice to the experience. The same kind of difficulties hold true with lesser forms of knowledge. And all of this shapes how we think about God. Again, I want to thank you for being here as we move into this second of the major concepts for this lesson 2 of the free online course, Is God Dead? Most people who believe in God tend to think that everything that exists in the universe came from God. History itself is a result of God. But it turns out God has a starting point in history. I should really say God's. Yes, the very idea of God that many of you are holding in your heads right now. Scholars have more or less tracked down when that all started in history. So if we track backwards in history, cross-referencing the Western mythical record against the Western historical and archaeological records, we have a good idea of where the idea of God comes from. At least 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens stepped onto the archaeological scene. And I say at least. These days, it's more like 500,000 years ago. Probably much older than that, but we'll go between 200,000 years ago and 500,000 years ago. Who it is that we are, some version of us, stepped onto the scene. Their form of subsistence included hunting and gathering. They came to subsist in small groups, we think, as a practical issue of safety. Against the inhospitable wilderness, there was strength in numbers. But as humans in groups tend to do, some of the people started getting onto the nerves of others in the group. For the sake of the illustration, imagine this is only happening in one group, but it's likely that the pattern was happening in different places and times among different groups of humans across the board. The conflict in the first group eventually leads to violence, and that violence leads to the first murder in human history. In response to this murder, some members of the one group punish the murderer and his or her family through banishment. What do? You've never experienced this before. Well, you kick them out. Another group then organizes around the banished family. That process continues. Over tens and even hundreds of thousands of years, this basic social structure leads to a world populated by bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers. Now, for the sake of the illustration, let's call each of these groups a tribe. These tribes were almost always nomadic, but they tended to stay in the same regions. They followed the rhythms of nature, and they stayed more or less in the same kind of cyclical patterns regionally. More like birds, they were probably moving in a kind of cycle, following the food or the seasons. Across these millennia, different groups came to associate themselves with features of the regions where they roamed. If one tribe was always in the presence of beavers, they came to think of themselves as a beaver tribe. When another tribe was always around lions, they became the lion tribe. They didn't have to be animals, however. Some tribes could have been the Big Mountain or the Fast Creek tribe. The point is that each member of this tribe took their identity from their affiliation with the tribe, and then that tribe took its identity from its affiliation with that geographic or natural object. Now, the objects, whether it's places or animals or plants that inspire the names of each of these tribes, we call a totem. As tribes come to organize themselves around their totems, the totems come to take on a transcendent quality, mattering more than any one member of the group. Each totem becomes the most important aspect of social life for that tribe. In fact, the world comes to be thought of in a dichotomy by the members of that tribe. There are things in the world that work to reinforce the totem, and scholars of religion come to call these things that reinforce totems sacred things. That's what a sacred thing is for many scholars. That is, things set apart from ordinary people and society. Now, on the other hand, the things in the world that potentially take away from the totem or that threaten it, scholars come to call profane. These things could include outsiders wanting to harm the group or insiders wanting to harm the totem. In either case, tribes would deal with profane people and objects through banishment or destruction. Supposing that many of the world's tribes operated according to this totemic principle, we can imagine that this totemism provided a kind of homeostatic existence for the tribes. They would sometimes fight internally as well as against other tribes, but so long as the totems were respected, most tribes and their members remained relatively safe and content. Now, this relative social equilibrium began to change with the advent of agriculture around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. When it started depends on where you look. Agriculture brought a variety of pressures and changes to the general totemic social structure, leading ultimately to the development of city-states where people began living together in much larger groups than the tribal setting. Now, living in cities and subsisting on agriculture allowed then for what we call in a technical way, the division of labor. This enabled the production of art and culture at a scale previously unseen in the archaeological or historical record. Classically, the Western world identifies the first 4 civilizations that include the Egyptian, the Minoan, the Mesopotamian, and the Indus Valley civilizations. Today, we know very little about the Indus Valley or Minoan civilizations. We know a great deal, however, about ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, including about their religious beliefs and practices. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, we see the introduction of the idea of gods to society. Here, the sacred-profane binary distinction already organized totemic life for them. And in Egypt and Mesopotamia, gods would both confirm or affirm, as well as complicate this sacred-profane distinction. In Egypt, the first pharaoh Menes came to unify 2 confederations of tribes. These were groups consisting of several different tribes that had banded together as a kind of mega-tribe. We remember these confederations of tribes as Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt came to be represented by the most powerful totem among the various tribal totems within that confederation. Power could be procured through belief in the deity, effectively meaning power was held and used by worship of the totem itself. Or you might think of it this way, that power may have rested with the military commander and was then represented by whatever totem that military commander associated themselves with. Either way, totemism was transforming at this point into polytheism, the simultaneous introduction of disparate totems into a singular geographic location that constitutes the first pantheon. Archaeological evidence shows that Upper Egypt experienced various totems, that is a scorpion, then a bull, and back to a scorpion, before the totem shifts to a name of a person, Menes, Narmer, in other words. That's the other name for Menes. And in this developing city-state, the power once held by the totem came to rest in the form of a political and military ruler, Menes. Lower Egypt went through a similar process of unification under various totemic symbols. The falcon is remembered today as Horus. The crocodile is another symbol that shows up somewhere between 5000 and 3000 BCE in Lower Egypt. These totems are attested to in the iconography of what we call the proto-dynastic rulers of Lower Egypt. Then, around 3100 BCE, Menes unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. The 2 confederations become one. The effect of this unification is that the symbolic and political importance of these totems, better still to now begin to think of these as gods, gets relocated into individual human persons. And we come to know these first god persons or person gods with the name Pharaoh. Different ethnic communities continued to maintain allegiance to and worship of their respective totems, yet the symbolic and material worlds came together in the body of Pharaoh. In the person of Menes and subsequent pharaohs, the Western world is introduced to the idea of what we call an anthropomorphic and agential God. Anthropomorphic here referring to moments when we attribute human-like qualities to non-human objects or animals, and in this case, deities. God and person, imago Dei, imago humando. Which is which came first, becomes murky at this point. There's a truth claim, as made by believers, that God set all of this in motion. And then there's a scientific or historical perspective, which holds that even God has a history, and this is one way of telling that history. The highest anthropomorphism is that of attributing to God the idea of agency. Agency in being, to be specific. But these are the first Western gods, and they had human qualities because they were made in the image of Pharaoh. That is, they have human qualities because they are human. The first truly powerful god in the world is a man. Now, this is the thread of the story most pertinent to my broader focus, but a slight detour helps flesh out the other origin story for the idea of God. So around the same time that Upper and Lower Egypt are unifying, another couple of confederations are slowly unifying as well in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in what is today Syria and Iraq. These are the Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations. The Akkadian people initially followed a totemic social structure very similar to the Egyptians. As a result, the Akkadian pantheon of gods came to look very similar to the Egyptian pantheon. However, the Sumerians are altogether different. They did not organize themselves totemically. In fact, we do not really know where they came from because we struggle to track them in the archaeological record. This has led to what some scholars call the Sumerian problem, and it's also the open question within the academic world that enables all sorts of conspiracy theories, big and small, to fill in that gap, that knowledge gap. We simply don't know. The Sumerians are as likely to have been just a strange human community that rose to power, or they could have come from on high. We do not know where they came from or how their mythology developed, although we do know a lot about their mythology, which is yet another conundrum within that Sumerian problem. Many of you might know this, but the Sumerians gave the Western world the very first symbolic representation of God. We call it the Dinger, or I call it the Dinger. I'll put an image of it right here. The Sumerians worshipped a sky god as well, called An, believing that as a people they emerged from workers or angels of the sky god, called, you guessed it, the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki have come to be part of contemporary popular culture because some have suggested that the Sumerian origin story is the origin story of all of humanity. According to this line of argument, we humans all came from some ancient alien race whose angels, the Anunnaki, created us as a slave race. Now, I want to make clear, we do not have evidence to support these claims, not evidence that is compelling. We have evidence that is tantalizing, but not compelling. Yeah, and I'm a fan. Back behind me is a sign, is the X-Files poster that says, I want to believe. I do. I'm compelled by stories of ancient aliens. It's not only interesting, but it's fun. And I like to think in those terms. But we don't have hard evidence to support those claims. What we can conclude, I think, is just as fascinating. In the Sumerian effort to document and archive their origin story, that is to write it down, they gave us another Western origin account of the idea of God, that of an abstract or symbolic authority. The Dinger is the first written symbol marking that abstract understanding of God. This is the history of where the idea that God is everything, or that God is nothing, God is infinite, God is eternal, God is in the stars. This is where that abstract representation first emerges also. I think that is miraculous. From what we know of these Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures, we can develop a portrait of the past that suggests God, for Westerners then, is about 5,000 years old and is expressed in these two ways. First, in the anthropomorphism, emerging as Pharaoh. Have you ever wondered why we don't just call them kings? This is why. They represent more than king. And second, through symbolic representation. Now, the history of God, as it matters for our conversation, picks up more forcefully again in Egypt. You might wonder why. Well, because Egypt shows up in the biblical record. As many scholars contend, what we come to understand as monotheism, that is the worship of one God and the prohibitions of belief in any other gods, first appears in Egypt under Amenhotep IV, around 1340 BCE, who began worshiping a singular god to the exclusion of the rest of the Egyptian pantheon. Now, Amenhotep IV attempted a brief political and religious revolution, which included changing his own name to Akhenaten in homage to the high god Aten. This revolution was short-lived, and upon his death, Egypt went back to understanding Pharaoh as the literal and figurative seat of power. What we generally regard as biblical monotheism emerges again connected to Egypt, but this time in the form of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt under the protection of the god Yahweh. Yahweh is one of many deities in a pantheon of deities, each associated with various tribes. And like them, Yahweh eventually comes together in different city-states and social contexts because different kinds of people are coming together, bringing their gods with them. It makes you wonder how so many people use the Bible to argue that they know what God wants for us when there's not even one God in that Bible. But I digress. So to conclude this quick history lesson, in the Bible, there is this idea we call the Imago Dei, that humans are made in the image of God. Well, if we look at history and archaeology, we see a kind of reversal. Humans may not be made in the image of God, but God comes to be made in the image of humans, specifically in the image of Pharaoh with all of the human attributes, as well as the divine attributes of being, all-powerful, all-knowing, and more. We'll talk more about that as we move into the third and fourth key concepts for this course, so stick around. Thanks again for sticking around. I appreciate your time and your interest. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit the like and the subscribe buttons for me. It really does a lot to help share the channel and what we're trying to do here. So to the third point of this free online course, is God dead? This is a kind of short but important point, and it's that monotheism is culturally specific. Now, here's what I mean. Most of you likely already have a working definition of monotheism, and it's belief in one God. But monotheism is actually a sociological and a historical term that describes the way that a group of people think about the universe. In other words, it does not refer to the belief, it refers to the community of believers. As I just mentioned, the Bible includes at least a few different gods. Usually, those other gods are described as false gods. Some of them, like superstitiously worshiping a golden calf, have no necessary cultural specificity. They're just arbitrary superstitions, like carrying a rabbit's foot on your keyring. But other gods, such as Baal, are gods that belonged to different ethnic communities. Now remember the link between gods and ethnicities I just mentioned above. Other gods include El Shaddai, literally meaning the many-breasted one. Some scholars think this is in reference to a feminine deity. Elohim is the name of another god. Here's where the scholars, I think, are more helpful than our pastors. Pastors usually preach this content as if these are different names for one singular god. Our worship songs are rife with examples of how we assume that all of these are different names for the same God. And eventually, this does become true. But the presence of these names in the earliest texts happened because different ethnic communities, each with different gods, were increasingly commingling and having to figure out which god would be the god of the community. Aha! That should be a reminder why we're here. God is dead is a statement about whether a community is healthy or not. It's not a statement about the end of the cosmos. It's a statement bearing cultural specificity. Now what's interesting, scholars have names for the different belief systems that happened across this history. Polytheism, of course, is the belief in a pantheon of many gods. Greeks and Romans are the classic examples of this in the Western world. Henotheism, on the other hand, refers to a community that believes that one God is greatest, but other ethnic groups' gods exist too. We see examples of this in ancient texts, including the texts that make up the Bible. Monolatry refers to a community that believes that one God is the most important, but it's still okay to worship lesser gods as well. Monotheism, we get taught in Sunday school, refers to the belief in one God. But it turns out this isn't really true. You might be surprised to realize, but what monotheism really refers to is a community where many gods exist, but there's a demand that no other gods be worshipped. Monotheism refers to a community that holds itself together around the idea of a singular deity and then around the subsequent idea that no other gods be worshipped or admitted as authoritative. Of course, the word does literally mean one God, so we'll forgive our pastors and Sunday school teachers. But practically, there's never actually been such a thing as a tribe or ethnic group or society or nation state that only believed in one God. Rather, they were tribes or societies or nation states that understood their identity in terms of the belief in one God and the prohibition of beliefs in other gods. Think about this. Monotheism is invented by Akhenaten in Egypt, effectively bringing monotheism onto the scene in history, but it also brings onto the scene the prohibition of the worship of other totems. This was a new concept. In this moment of history, however, monotheism is born alongside of its sibling, idolatry. Idolatry is the fifth and the last key point for this lesson. Before we talk about idolatry, I want to talk a little bit more about another concept, theism. Again, I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate your time and your interest. And so let's get straight to it. If monotheism is a sociological concept, then you can consider theism to be its philosophical counterpart. A person practices monotheism, but a person is a theist. Who you are as a believer is a theist. Hence, who you are as a non-believer is an atheist. Theism understands reality or the universe as ordered by one creator God who is somehow transcendent of that creation and with additional powers of revelation. In the history of philosophy, theism is often distinguished from deism, which is the belief that there was once a creator God, but that for whatever reason, that God has now detached from its creation and is completely hands-off. In the United States, the most famous deist is Thomas Jefferson. The other common alternative to theism is pantheism, which is increasingly popular amongst many New Age proponents. This is the idea that God is in all things, or God is all things. Everything is everything, as Lauryn Hill once put it. In my own work, I've suggested that one way to define theism is as belief in the functional utility of belief. That's just a clunky way of describing the impact of belief on how the world or society works. When we believe in God, regardless of whether that God is real or not, our believing in the same thing has a powerful impact on the world that we live in. Theism is also where modern philosophers spend most of their time in reflection on God. Subsequent classes will discuss thinkers like the Frenchman René Descartes, the Scot Dave Hume, and my personal favorite, the German Ludwig Feuerbach. All of these philosophers responded to the basic formulation of God's attributes that had been created over about 1,000 years of history. That is, what makes God God? The basic formula is this: transcendence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. There's one more: immutability. Transcendence refers to the idea that God is somehow radically distinct from God's creation. And different traditions will quibble, debating what kind of influence God holds over this creation today. Omnipotence, of course, refers to being all-powerful. Omniscience, all-knowing. Omnibenevolence, all good. God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. If it comes from God, it is good, regardless of the human misery it might cause. In the face of tragedies, in fact, you'll often hear people say things like it was all part of God's plan, or the Lord works in mysterious ways. These are statements that help to reinforce the common idea that God is good all the time, that God is omnibenevolent. Our knowledge of these attributes of God comes from different sources, usually remembered as the four sources of theology, which are scripture, reason, tradition, and experience. And all of our knowledge about God, or about what to say about God, is filtered through those different sources, we call them. The Bible tells us a lot, but so does philosophical reasoning. So do the various traditions we participate in within monotheistic communities. And so do our experiences with one another and even with God. Theology is done in community. This doesn't mean your opinion isn't important to theologizing as an enterprise and how we understand God. It is. But just because you believe it doesn't make it true. I have a t-shirt I wear that says, "Don't believe everything you think. There are thoughts and there are beliefs." A thought is a thought. It's inside of ourselves. A belief is when a thought comes to be bearing down on another person who has thoughts that may or may not resonate with your own. Now, experience is emphasized in Jefferson's emphasis on the individual relationship with God as they understand God. This is a trouble that deism gets in. We may have a personal relationship with God, we do, but God does not maintain a personal relationship with only us. Many of us forget that. And one last attribute is worth mentioning. That is immutability. This is the weakest of the attributes because this has been the most contested of the different attributes. not everyone is all on the same page with respect to whether or not God changes over time. Is God immutable? Does God change? If yes, doesn't that open the possibility for doubt of the other attributes? And if not, doesn't that impact the amount of involvement God has in the world? Isn't, in fact, what becomes the Christian Bible a story about God essentially changing God's mind? Certain New Testament writers do jumping jacks to make this a Jewish story, in large part, scholars think, in order to demonstrate that this is one cohesive story. But is it? Is it? That doesn't make it not true. Me asking that doesn't mean I'm attacking your faith. It just means, it just helps to make sure that we're all on the same page. And like this last attribute of immutability, there's room for debate. The concept of immutability also offers a pretty great segue into three of the most common theistic arguments for the existence of God. These include the already mentioned cosmological argument, so I won't go back over that, but they also include the teleological argument and the ontological argument. The teleological argument is famously remembered as Paley's watchmaker argument. Paley was a philosopher, theologian, and the argument holds that just as a watch found in a field must have had a maker, you look at the watch, you see the cogs that have been crafted to work together, so must the complex design and order of the universe have a designer, who in this case is God. Paley argues that the intricate structures in nature, such as the eye and the wing of a bird, indicate that they were designed and created by a highly intelligent and powerful being. The argument is meant to demonstrate that the complexity and purpose in the natural world are evidence of God's existence, and that the universe is like a machine that was created by a divine watchmaker. This might resonate with many of you, as it remains extremely popular today, although most folks don't any longer remember it as Paley's watchmaker argument. Today, it's most often referred to as the intelligent design argument. In fact, where I work at Lehigh University, perhaps our most famous faculty member is the biologist Michael Behe. Behe argues that some biological systems, such as the bacterial flagellum, are irreducibly complex. This means that these systems are composed of several interdependent parts, and that if any one of these parts were removed, just like a watch, the system would not work. According to Behe, this high level of complexity and interdependence cannot be explained by Darwinian evolution, but instead points to the existence of an intelligent designer. Here, in this case, most folks hold that that designer is God. I'd say this is about as compelling an argument as one can find these days that would try to prove the existence of God. Hence, it's still extremely popular. Important to note here, these arguments work because they rely on the usual criteria we use to determine truth: logic and experience. Important to note here, these arguments work because they rely on the usual criteria we use to determine truth, born of philosophy and theology historically. That is, logic and experience. The ontological argument is based on the idea first formulated by Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century that God is, quote, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, God is the most perfect being that can be imagined, possessing all the properties that make something great to the greatest degree possible. Anselm used this idea to develop a logical proof for the existence of God. He argued that if God exists only in the mind, then a being that exists both in the mind and in reality would be greater. But if such a being exists, then it must be God. Hence, the attributes matter so much, because nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, God must exist in both the mind and in reality. So here's the classical logical formulation of that argument in a syllogism. So premise 1, it is possible that a greatest possible being exists. Premise 2, if it is possible that a greatest possible being exists, then that being must exist in reality. Conclusion, therefore, a greatest possible being exists in reality. Now, for the atheists and the non-believers in the audience, you might not be compelled by that, and that's okay. But for the believers, it seems confusing if not compelling. So premise 1 asserts that it is logically possible for a being to exist that is maximally great, meaning it has the properties that make something great. Power, knowledge, goodness, those things I mentioned, the attributes. Premise 2 argues that if it is logically possible for such a being to exist, then it must actually exist, because a being that has maximal greatness must exist in all possible worlds, including this, the actual world. Ergo, God exists. Now, this ontological argument in its syllogism form is a formalization of this idea, using logical reasoning to demonstrate that the existence of God as the most perfect being is a necessary conclusion based on the concept of maximal greatness. In essence, the ontological argument uses the idea of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived to show that God must exist in reality, not just in the mind. As I conclude this section of the free online course, Is God Dead?, it's important to note that arguments like what I've just offered here are distinct. They're very different from what we call the faith-based arguments, such as, quote, God is real because he saved me from my sins. When we're trying to get to the bottom of a question like, is God dead?, it's important for us to be realistic about what kind of evidence and arguments we use. It doesn't mean that that story doesn't matter. For instance, your Aunt Louise might have spent 20 years committing bank robberies, and then, because of a single experience at church, she cleaned herself up from that lifestyle. That single experience may have completely changed her life and impacted the lives of all of you around Aunt Louise. And that's wonderful. It genuinely is. But that story by itself is not nearly as convincing as these formal philosophical arguments. At least not for many, and at least not in the history of the West. Now, that said, 10,000 stories just like Aunt Louise's may be more convincing still. And we'll talk about that as this course progresses. So, okay, with that, you've got your first 4 key concepts, so let's get to the last of these, idolatry. So again, I want to thank everyone for showing up, for learning, for thinking through these issues and concepts. And so with that, we'll get right into this last of the key concepts, which is idolatry. Nearly all of you, I'm guessing, have heard of the 10 Commandments, one of the most famous moral and legal codes in human history. It was believed to have been given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now here's the first of those 3 commandments, right? The first is, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods but me. The second, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And the third, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Now these 10 commandments have been an influential part of both Jewish and Christian tradition, as well as Islamic tradition, and are still considered by many people today to be a cornerstone of moral and ethical behavior. A whole lot of people want them in courtrooms, right? They have been referenced and included in various legal and religious documents throughout history and continue to be a source of guidance and inspiration for many people around the world. But note these first 3 mandates, commandments. They focus on idolatry. Our God is a jealous God. He reigns from heaven and earth. I don't mean to be blasphemous. I just mean to draw our attention to that. Idolatry and jealousy go hand in hand. Now, specifically, idolatry refers to the worship of a divinity represented by a substitute for the divine called an idol. Usually, idolatry is focused on visual representations such as iconography, images, signs, and other stand-ins for the actual God. Examples of this include customs among many observant Jews to not write the full name of God, choosing instead to offer something like G*D in moments when it's necessary to write the word God. We see from this behavior, these prohibitions of representing God, an emphasis on the importance of preventing idolatry. Have you ever thought it's really ironic that we censor both sacred and profane words? Another example was in the news recently regarding the college teacher who showed a painting said to represent Muhammad. The teacher was fired and the dust is still settling from the fiasco. But the problem involved an apparent disrespect of Muslim students, many of whom hold that to depict images of the Prophet is blasphemous and borders on idolatry. Like the very idea of God, Tradition suggests idolatry begins with the Israelites delivered out of Egypt. More likely, it began in Egypt. As mentioned earlier with Akhenaten's religious reforms, it became illegal to worship other gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Soon this was reversed, and the reforms ended. But the prohibitions against worshiping other gods likely left an impact on the communities that became the ancient Israelites. So some knowledge of the biblical Exodus event is helpful to move forward. So according to the biblical account, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years until Moses, a prophet of Egypt, led them out of Egypt and into the desert to receive the Ten Commandments and the laws of God. The Exodus began with God instructing Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand that he let the Israelites go. When Pharaoh refused, God sent a series of plagues upon Egypt, culminating in the death of all firstborn sons, right? The Israelites were then able to leave Egypt, but Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued them with his army. Just as the Israelites were about to be trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, God parted the waters, allowing the Israelites to cross onto dry land. The Egyptian army was then destroyed as the waters closed in on them. But the story pivots, right? Because the Israelites then spend the next 40 years in the desert, where they received the Ten Commandments and other laws from God, and where Moses prepared them to enter the Promised Land. But it was a desert, a wilderness experience. The story of the Exodus is considered a seminal event in the history of the Israelites and is central to both Jewish and Christian tradition. It's seen as a powerful demonstration of God's power and love, and is considered to be a symbol of liberation and freedom for people around the world. What's not often emphasized from that story is that when the Israelites were lost in the wilderness, they were encountering many different communities with different practices and beliefs. Each of these communities had their own gods, their own totems. Some overlapped, but some were unique. And the Israelites were feeling lost. They were hungry, scared, tired. How would you feel being lost in the desert with no clear direction? If someone came to you and said, "Hey, my God's got the inside track on happiness," what would you do? The concern over idolatry, as we inherit it today, emerges in this setting of religious and cultural competition. Now, adding some complication to all of this, but nevertheless vital to understanding idolatry, is the very beginning of the story of Exodus. In Exodus 3, Moses has an experience of a burning bush. I'm sure many of you have heard this story. This bush is on fire, but it's not consumed by the fire. And in wonderment, Moses goes to take a closer look. Why wouldn't he? I would. And soon the bush begins to speak to him, telling Moses that it is Moses' duty to go free the Israelites. This is how the mandate from God emerges. This is how the adventure begins. The story's written without many articles preceding the word God. By article, I mean the linguistic notion of article, a or the. There are very few that precede the word God. This has the impact of conditioning the reader into thinking that God is already known by Moses, and that God is just a thing or a high being that everyone already believes in. But no, that's not the story. That's not the case. That's not true. That's what we assume. It's not even biblical. It's more useful to think of Moses as having an experience with a God rather than the one true God. And the evidence for this is simple. God tells Moses that he's the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This indicates that there was a kind of religious competition going on. There were many gods on the ground. God had to clarify who God was. Moses is still not sure of who this God is, so he asks for God's name. He says, "What God shall I tell the Egyptians sent me to free the Israelites?" Now, why it is that it's this moment in the Bible where idolatry kind of comes online is understood in how God responds. God answers with a paradox. I am that I am. Now, the answer from God is effectively a non-answer. And that non-answer comes to be the most hallowed name of God, remembered as the Tetragrammaton, the four-lettered word, and transliterated from the Hebrew into English as Yahweh. This is as close as we get to the identity of the God that spoke to Moses. So here we are in a landscape of religious competition, all these gods vying for one another. And here is this God that Moses has this experience with, who refuses to name God's self. The Tetragrammaton appears over 6,000 times in the Hebrew Bible and is considered by many Jews to be too holy to be pronounced. The exact pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton has been lost over time, but it's believed to have been pronounced as Yahweh or Jehovah. In the Bible, Yahweh is often used to refer to God in a personal and intimate way, and it's believed to contain the essence of God's being and power, representing the unnameable and infinite nature of God. It's considered to be a constant reminder of God's presence and power in the world, and is still used in Jewish liturgical and spiritual practices, as well as many Christian traditions and denominations. But here's the paradox of idolatry within monotheism. The God that prohibits the worship of false idols or substitutes does not provide its own identity to those who would worship it. You can think of this as the point at which idolatry really becomes a crucial corollary to monotheism. At this point, it becomes a type of social community that organizes itself according to people worshiping a God with no name. It becomes a specific type of social community organized around two twin concepts. Here we now have a nameless God demanding that no other gods be worshipped, when the other gods have names. That is, they have ethnic, geographic, cultural, hereditary affiliations with the communities. Over and against this Yahweh God, where the very name Yahweh represents the namelessness, the dislocatedness, the wilderness itself. So the God that does not provide an identity is also the God where we receive the prohibition, rather, to not seek out gods with names. And just let that resonate. As this free online course of Is God Dead continues, this will be a crucial concept that unfolds across our conversations. Yahweh forbids worship of foreign gods and the making of images that would serve as a stand-in for Yahweh. This means that idolatry comes to be understood as both giving the name of God to that which is not God, as well as associating a god or gods with Yahweh that should not be associated with Yahweh. Now fast forward to the 20th century, the well-known French existentialist and Marxist, I know, but I'm not interested in that piece of his thinking. Jean-Paul Sartre, he develops the concept of bad faith to respond to social circumstances where a person knows what they really are, but trick themselves into pretending that they are something different. You might say God, because of the invention of idolatry, forces monotheists into a situation of bad faith. Or you might say that God is the first example of this bad faith. Here, not making a moral judgment, but making a judgment about the disconnection between the initial person and community on the one hand, and the totem on the other hand. Some of you might be thinking, yes, but suppose that God's answer about being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is enough. Well, yes, perhaps it is enough if you come from that lineage, if you're Jewish. But what of the Christians and Muslims? This also helps explain why it's so contentious, both within and outside of Jewish circles and communities, to talk about who is or is not Jewish. It has everything to do with how we interpret these particular stories, as well as these stories and how we interpret them will have a bearing in history on anti-Semitism, on how much violence and oppression Jews faced in the face of all of these uncertainties. But what of the Muslims and Christians? In order to make sure that God remains immutable, New Testament writers made a point to draw connections between what Jesus is saying and teaching and Jewish tradition. Perhaps he, Jesus, but especially his followers, ended up worrying Jewish leaders around the time. Islam will arrive several hundred years later, and it will have an issue with both the worship of false gods and incomplete representations of God. Jesus, you might imagine, in these terms, is a walking example of bad faith and idolatry. Again, I'm not being blasphemous here. I'm trying to get all of us to think critically about these concepts that we inherit and we tend to take for granted, no matter what side of the fence we're on. For some, Jesus is a false idol because God can't be limited to a human person. For others, Jesus is a representative of the God who has always refused representation. You could think of this both in terms of his teachings, but also all that is represented in the crucifixion. Golgotha. What does it mean to have a dead God? How can he be the promise and the peril? How can he be both at one time? So sit with that. So to conclude this lesson, you might consider the paradoxical place of Jesus to represent the center of monotheism. Not in terms of importance, but in terms representing how monotheistic societies work. The society is organized around worship of a singular God, amongst many gods, as options. Who belongs in that society is determined by whether or not they worship that singular God. What we consider a God and what we call an idol are not set in stone, no pun intended, but are contextually determined. They're what we call hermeneutically determined. They're based on our contexts and our ambitions and our past experiences. Whether one totem is a god and the rest idols, or whether one God is good and another bad, or whether we fall on our knees in supplication of them all, depends on where the God is in any given moment and who is surrounding that God. As this course continues in further lessons, be thinking about this relationship between where we are and what we're saying or thinking about God, and especially, of course, about God's death. So to summarize, in this second lesson from the free online course, Is God Dead?, I've offered 5 key concepts and constellations of ideas necessary for answering the question of, is God dead? These have included an explanation of how philosophy and theology are the oldest ways Westerners have sought truth. And I've also offered a plausible, but not certain, history of where the very idea of God came from, as well as I've emphasized that monotheism is a culturally specific sociological category. It's a term. It doesn't refer to the belief. It refers to the community of believers. The 4th key concept raised was to distinguish theism as the proper name of that belief system, often confused with monotheism, and to offer then several examples of famous philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And then lastly, as just now we discussed in some detail, the concept of idolatry and how it is always a counterpart to the concept of monotheism. We'll speak much more about all of these concepts over the remaining lessons in this course. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed this content. If so, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for the channel. And if not, thanks for checking things out and offer your thoughts and feedback in the comments. Please be civil. All of this is coming from a place of respect and I think love. I'll leave it for you all to decide that. For now, I genuinely appreciate your time. So till next time, I'm Christopher Driscoll, and I'm grateful for the time you spent with me. Bye for now.